On this episode of Race Talk with Lane and Eugene, we discuss how women of color have been the driving force in the push for racial equity and social justice. Our guest is Ms. Judith Beville, who will discuss sisters, suffrage, and social justice.
Hey everyone, welcome to Race Talk Revolution. I am your co-host Eugene Holden, and I co-host this beautiful show with Reverend Lane Cobb, who will be with you in just a moment. I want to say thank you to all of those who are new to Race Talk Revolution. This is a platform where we talk about situations about racism within the United States, and it's also a platform where your voice matters. This Race Talk Revolution is a respectful, inclusive place where we have conversation. It's a community where we have respectful and inclusive conversations where every voice is heard, every voice is appreciated, and every voice matters. Lane?
And yes, thank you, Eugene. We're so happy to be starting another 8-week series of Race Talk. And this month, for the rest of this month, we are happy to be celebrating Women's History Month. We will be inviting women to speak about their achievements and to celebrate the achievements of women in general. I will now introduce our speaker today. We are pleased to have with us Ms. Judith Beville, who will share with us some facts and insights about the phenomenon of women of color being a driving force behind the fight for civil rights and social justice. So prior to embarking on a career of local politics, Ms. Judith Beville was an educator in Westchester County, New York, and held several leadership positions in public sector administration. She is the founder and chair of the 400 Years Project, a county-wide collaboration focusing on the historical contribution of African Americans to this country and this county, and has partnered with women's organizations to co-sponsor workshops that include issues related to the safety and welfare of women, such as human trafficking and human rights. She currently serves on the Advisory Council for the New York State Mentoring Program, the Executive Committee of the Westchester Municipal Officials Association, and currently is leading several voter education and participation initiatives. So welcome, please, Ms. Judith Beville.
Thank you, Lane, and thank you, Eugene. It is truly an honor, and also I consider it a blessing to be your guest today, as well as to be part of your group with your guests. I'd just like to start off by thanking both of you, and also saying that I'd like to dedicate this presentation to my mother, Ethelberg Hart Beville, who was born in 1920, the year of the passage of the 19th Amendment. She was a Brownie Scout leader. First, she was forced to drop out of high school at 10th grade because she was a foster child. And back then they believed that foster care children must be taught a trade. So she later became a mother, a Brownie Scout leader, a Girl Scout leader. She and my dad were foster parents that took in over 100 children over their 56 years of marriage. And she was an elections inspector. She later was elected to become the president of the New York State Foster Parents Association. She delivered speeches around the country on behalf of children, and she was one of few women in her position. So this is dedicated to Mom. So I'd like to begin with a backdrop. Just like there's a backdrop to every movie, there's a backdrop to every story. Lane just shared the backdrop to my story. I'd like to share a backdrop to to African-American women here in this country. African-American women have been at the forefront of the fight for racial equality, equal rights, voting rights, economic, educational, civil rights, and political involvement. They organized the Freedom Riders and participated in the Underground Railroad, led the Underground Railroad, and they remained the most consistent voting bloc in the United States to stand up for rights of marginalized people. Their history, though, was distinctly different from that of our Caucasian sisters in this country, with the exception of a brief period during which indentured servitude allowed each to earn their freedom after a certain number of years. From the beginning, African-American women, though, were an unprotected class, meaning that as the majority were enslaved during the first 250 years of their presence in this country, they were considered property through the system of chattel slavery, and therefore subject to inhumane treatment, stripped of their humanity, considered comparable to animals or a machine with regards to product production, subject to abuse of every form imaginable and unimaginable, starved nearly to death while working in the fields, often worked to death, forced to enter into sexual liaisons with enslaved men who were strangers for the purpose of breeding. Rarely were they allowed to marry. They were separated and sold away from children and families, bought, sold, and raped, considered a right under the policies of ownership of slavery. They were killed, discarded of, and lynched at will. So the struggle of African-American women, while associated with the fight for the right to vote, was much broader in scope with regards to their struggle for humane treatment, equality, civil rights, rights to access as citizens of the United States, as well as voting rights. So we're just going to kind of fast forward in lieu of time to the Civil War and the end of the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, we all know that there were three main amendments passed: the 13th, 14th, and 15th, between 1865 and through the mid-1870s. So during Reconstruction, these three amendments to the Constitution were passed in an effort to establish equality for Black Americans. The 13th Amendment, as we all know, was adopted in 1865, which abolishes slavery or involuntary servitude except in the punishment of a crime. So therefore, hence our prison system is still remains as a form of slavery, okay? The 14th Amendment, adopted in 1868, defines all people born in the United States as citizens, requires due process of law, and requires equal protection to all people. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prevents the denial of a citizen's vote based on race, color, or servitude. So just moving forward into what the 15th Amendment truly represented with regards to efforts by women. As a backlash to the 13th Amendment, Black codes and Jim Crow laws targeted at limiting the rights of African Americans, limiting their movement, their physical movement from one place to another, limiting access to the same or equal public facilities as those available to Caucasian Americans. State laws were passed throughout southern states and enforced in parts of the North as well. Including the Midwest, were designed to in effect to ignore any attempts on the part of federal legislation to consider African Americans equal to whites. So these states got away with ignoring federal legislation. So this series of oppressive laws and tactics employed a rigidly enforced system of segregation based in every area of society throughout the South, with severe consequences for those who did not comply. Also, these laws were enforced to force African Americans into conditions of dependence upon whites for their livelihoods, as well as to force African Americans to provide free labor, often under laws brutal and inhumane, circumstances that help build the infrastructure of local municipalities, as well as to generate profits from these states through a system called convict leasing, where Southern states ultimately made tens of millions of dollars by forcing Black men into forced labor camps to work for Northern industries such as U.S. Steel and J.P. Morgan Chase, many banks, and many industries, including, I don't know if we all know, but free labor during slavery helped to generate the money that produced the textile industries in the Northeast that generated money to build the Ivy League colleges, such as Brown University, Yale, Harvard. And this is all in a book called Complicity. You might want to look it up. So Black codes and state laws were passed at different periods in the United States to enforce racial segregation and curtail the power of Black voters. Now, during Reconstruction, Republicans had become very weary of protecting African Americans in the South. So with the passage of the 15th Amendment, many Black men who participated in politics by voting and holding office, 2 were elected to Congress, and over 600 African American men in local and state elected positions throughout the South. One of the first reactions against Reconstruction was to deprive African American men of their right to vote. Now, at the same time, it's interesting to note that women were organizing. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were organizing to acquire the vote for women. However, there was a conflict, okay, over whether or not acquiring the vote for women should also include acquiring the vote for Black people. Now, when the 15th Amendment allowed Black men to vote, then these coalitions kind of dissolved under the strain of political conflicts. But let's go ahead, let's continue talking about this, because I just find this so fascinating. Because of the opportunities to form coalitions, and those coalitions broke up in the midst of conflict around race. Okay, now, so let's see, I'm going to talk a little bit about the efforts to prevent Black men from voting. So poll taxes were imposed, literacy tests were imposed, and all white primaries were created, all white political groups were created. And after a series of threats and lynchings and beatings and all kinds of bullying tactics, the percentage of African Americans who were registered to vote around the 1870s, which was close to 90% of African American men who actually were who met the criteria for voting, well, that percentage went down to only 3% by the 1940s. And that was due to voter suppression. Okay, now, and I mentioned this, as evidence of the decline during Reconstruction, the percentage of African American voting went from 90% to 3%. Reconstruction officially ended with the Compromise of 1877 regarding the Tilden-Hayes presidential race. Remember that? So the Southern Democrats agreed to concede, all right? Even though Tilden had won the popular vote with several other Southern states that had not yet been counted, the Southern Democrats cut a deal with Republicans, allowing Rutherford B. Hayes to become president if he withdrew the federal troops from the South. The federal troops protected African Americans and protected their rights. However, with that compromise of 1877, the federal troops withdrew. And this allowed Southern Democrats to regain control of the South and return it de facto slavery in every sense, even worse than de jure slavery. Southern states then enacted more discriminatory laws. Efforts to enforce white supremacy by legislation increased, and African Americans tried to assert their rights through legal challenges. However, this effort led to a disappointing result in 1896 with the Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, the so-called separate but equal facilities, including separate but equal laws, establishing separate but so-called equal facilities, including in public transportation and schools, were all constitutional. From this time until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, discrimination and segregation were legal and enforceable. Okay, this was just 57 years ago, folks, in 1964. So against that backdrop, concurrently and prior to, during and after the Civil War, throughout Reconstruction and afterwards, in the fight for civil rights of America, Black women have steadily led the way for centuries. Black women led the Underground Railroad, as was mentioned before, led the struggle for civil rights and equal rights. And so I just want to highlight who some of those women were. One of the first that was mentioned, that's been mentioned throughout our history, one of the first, there were 5 main Black suffragists in American history, but there were many more. So the first we're going to highlight was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was born in 1825, died in 1911. But she became a genuine celebrity as an orator. She was considered at the time second only to abolitionist Frederick Douglass in terms of prominent African-American writers. She was born free to free African-Americans in Maryland, and as a writer and educator, she wrote for local African-American newspapers, later writing a novel called Lola Leroy, which was one of the first to be published by a Black woman in the United States, told the story of a mixed race woman raised as white, but once it was found that she had a few drops of Negro in her, she was sold into slavery. And through this book, Frances Harper addresses the issues of race, gender, and class. She moved to the North in 1850 and later became very heavily involved with white women in the movement for voters' rights. She connected with white women voter rights movements, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. However, during this time, it was very evident that these women were, Anthony and Caton, were really advocating for the rights of white women. And Harper spoke at a convention in 1866, the National Women's Rights Convention. She said, "You white women speak here of rights, and I speak of wrongs," calling them out for their lack of female solidarity across racial divides. So let's just note that Black women were calling for voting rights, not only for African-American women and men, but for all women. Racism persisted even in the most socially progressive movements of the era. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was, excuse me, a dominant white suffrage organization, held conventions that included Black women. However, Black women were forced to march separately in suffrage parades. What's of great significance here at the time of 1866 was that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were at one part, were organizers of the American Equal Rights Association, AERA, the American Equal Rights Association. It was a group that they formed with abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who was an African-American man, who was also standing up for women's rights, but also as an abolitionist standing up for the rights of African Americans. The organization's stated goal was to win voting rights for both women and African Americans. However, tension arose because Black women felt excluded from this equation, assuming that they felt the reference to women in that goal statement referred only to white women and the reference to African Americans referred only to the men, since men at this time and heretofore were the only ones who could vote. So at a critical point during a convention just 3 years later in 1869, Frederick Douglass argued that the Association for Equal Rights, the American Equal Rights Association, should support the 15th Amendment for the right for African American men to vote. And at that convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton made a statement that not only did she disagree, but she suggested that Black men and male immigrants did not have the intelligence with which to make sound political decisions or judgment. Well, long story short, the organization dissolved after only 3 years over heated debates about whether to actually support the 15th Amendment, which eventually allowed Black men to vote. Just think, if only the women had been able to see the potential benefit and the greater good for all, had they been able to put forth a unified and all-inclusive agenda, voting rights for, well, at least white women may have been secured 50 years earlier than the actual passage of the 19th Amendment of 1920. So just think, if we had come together back then during the 1870s, 50 years earlier, we may have been able to eke out voting rights for everyone. But this biracial coalition that formed during abolition was very tenuous and eventually fractured due to conflicts about what should be the status of freed Blacks. This often based on whites having conflicting attitudes about the humanity of Blacks and if they were equal to whites, stated Pearl Doe, professor of political science and African American studies at Emory University. Even though their efforts were often unsupported by the white women's suffrage groups, Black women consistently championed the concept of equal rights for all, including voting rights, prison abolition, health inequality, LGBTQ issues, pay equity, children's rights, and the issues of poor people. Okay, so considering the fact that, all right, so I'm just going to go on just to mention the other three Black suffragists. Mary Ann Chadd, 1823 to 1893, was also born to free African Americans. And I just want to mention that Frances Harper and Mary Ann Chadd, they lived in homes that were part of the Underground Railroad. So they might be considered today's African American women who were educated and part of the quote unquote middle class. But nevertheless, they fought for voting rights for all women. Mary Church Terrell, educator, writer, organizer, who focused on anti-lynching, Jim Crow, and convicts leasing. She was the daughter of formerly enslaved people, but she also emerged as a major speaker in the women's movement. Her motto was "Lifting as we climb," through the organization that she helped found, the National Association of Colored Women. Nanine, Helene, Burroughs, 1879 to 1961, was also a major speaker or major advocate of the women's suffragist movement as an African-American suffragist. and also during this time fought vehemently against lynching. It's important to know that the most important question that Black activists were concerned with from the early 1900s all the way up to 1920, years before the 19th Amendment, were lynching and white mob violence against Black people, in addition to women earning the right to vote. And then Ida B. Wells, who was the first Black woman to own 2 newspapers. She was a staunch leader of women's rights. Given the short amount of time that I have here, I'm just going to mention that major African-American female politicians such as Shirley Chisholm, Dorothy Height, Fannie Lou Hamer, and this is during more contemporary times from the 1950s up to the present, Barbara Jordan, Patricia Roberts Harris, Carol Moseley Brown, Angela Davis, Michelle Obama, Condoleezza Rice, Susan Rice, Cynthia McKinney, Barbara Lee, Sheila Jackson, Ali, Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, were all women who advocated for the rights of all women to be politically involved. Stacey Abrams, candidate for governor, state of Georgia, who lost under major controversy and suspicion of voter suppression, is the founder of Fair Fight, which encourages fair elections and voter registration. She is also the founder of a Now account, which works to help small businesses grow. She has been credited with increasing voter registration in Georgia by an estimated 800,000 new voters in the last presidential election. What woman in history of this country has literally flipped a state? And yes, as we continue to go forward, I quote and support Frances Harper's statement that unless Black and white women work together, we, going forward in the future, must embrace this concept of working together in order to achieve the successes that women have accomplished politically, educationally, in health, and in every aspect of society going forward. I have much more to say, but I received a note from our moderator that my time is up. I'm just enjoying this, and I hope that we've all learned a little bit together here. Thank you.
We certainly have, and don't go anywhere because you're going to have some questions, so don't worry. We have more to learn, and thank you very much for being here. We're so pleased. So one of the things that, it was a perfect ending, by the way, the working together, absolutely right. Because without allies, our power is greatly diminished. But one of the things that has been said is that when Black women run, we all win, right? When Black women work, we all win, because exactly as you said, Black women organizers have always understood the intersection between race and gender and sex and the economy, children, all of those things have got to come in. So whenever Black women have organized, we've always had that interest of the whole and not just of some. So how, when we're talking about Marion Wright Edelman, we're talking about let me not even, I can't go through all these people, but
Marion
there's so
Barry,
many, right?
Marion Barry, there's so many that we
Barry.
didn't mention, yes.
Well, there's lots that we didn't mention. There are many, and I want to encourage folks to just Google. There are so many things out there. There's an article that I found that said 26 women civil rights leaders that we need to know, 7, 9, 15. Just Google Black women civil rights, and you will find so many people you don't know about. We don't know that there were women who were affecting the rights activism of Martin Luther King, of the Black Panther Party. There were women at the head of Black Panther Party saying, I don't agree with this nonviolent stuff either, and helping to organize to get the word out, or also to help the Black Panthers to do the beneficial things they did out in the community to rally folks into their cause. There's so many other women that have been at the forefront, but voting rights, education has been a huge push, obviously, for African-American women, and rights for children, welfare of children. And of course, now we have LGBTQ, as you said, and we can't say enough about this. We could talk for another, year about this. So I just want to go ahead. I'm going to turn it back over to my co-host Eugene, who will say some things about Q&A, and then we'll get going. So Judith, just thank you so much. And you can tell I'm excited about this. I have to say, I've never been prouder to be a Black woman in my life. I'm 60 years old right now. Black Lives Matter and all of the organizations that sprung up because of Stacey Abrams' work, and the organization in Baltimore, Black Girls Vote, now have the ear of the people in the White House, and it's only 5 years, and started with this opportunity to have Black girls, young women, understand the importance of them going and having a voice. So this is just work that is just now more important than it ever has been. And it's just been centuries, and right on.
Thank you. Ms. Beville, thank you very much. So just real fast, I know I have a couple of people who have raised their hands. Just real fast about the Q&A. If you want to raise your hand, over on the bottom of your screen, take your cursor over to the far right, and you see the icon called reactions. Click on that, and there's a button that says raise hand. And then once you raise your hand, I will get you in there. I'm making a list of who is up, because after a while it starts to switch around. In your questions, keep it down to about a minute or less, all right? Because we only have a certain amount of time. And with that being said, we will go with Amber first.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Holden, and it was wonderful listening to you, Judith. I learned a lot. My husband actually walked in halfway through the conversation, and he was actually taking in a lot of information. I guess my main question is, as history has shown, when Black women do the work of trying to get grassroots organizations set up, mobilizing people, pointing out issues, and we have been successful in most of the campaigns that we do. So how can Black women be, I guess my question is, how do Black women choose whether they should focus more on race or whether they should focus more on their feminism? Because I feel like we've been trying to do both and it's not been working out. And so I don't know if we focus more on feminism, will we alienate Black men and make them feel like they're in the struggle by themselves? Or if we focus more on racism, and do we not take care of ourselves in the sense of not being able to get full and equal rights as women?
Mm-hmm.
Great question.
Okay, if I may just address that from my perspective. See, I think that women have to focus on, first of all, the fact that we are partners with our men. We have to forge partnerships that allow us to find common ground with our men. I think that it's important that we continue to fight for and struggle for the gains that we have made, and to fight for equal status with regards to respecting our input and our contributions to humanity, but the issues that protect man's humanity towards each other should be the issues that we come together around. That's just my feeling. I'm concerned about this, forging or promoting a one against the other. I know and I'm aware of the fact that, of course, we're all aware of our history in this country, how men have, for the most part, suppressed the involvement of women at certain levels, or at levels in society. However, we are there now. We are at the table. Yes, do more of us need to be at the table? Absolutely. But as we come to the table, I think we need to look for areas where we can collaborate, negotiate, and find common ground for the better good of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have Brother Jason, who's up next.
Yeah, thank you, Eugene. And thank you so much, Judith. I'm learning a lot today. The question I'm having is, as I'm looking at the political landscape today, and we're seeing so many attempts at voter suppression laws in many, many states, and it's obvious to me the racist intent behind so much of that. Mm-hmm. What's less apparent, and I'm curious about from your perspective, if there's a way that those laws, if enacted, would disproportionately hurt women, Black women, as opposed to it only being a racial issue.
The voter suppression laws?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've seen from the past, listen, voter suppression laws kept Black women from voting for 100 years, from the beginning, from the initial start of the women's movement, which started back in 1865. All right, so while white women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, voter suppression throughout the South and even in northern states, including Connecticut, was still practiced up until 1964. Okay, so it was 100 years. It was literally 100 years from 1865 to roughly 1965 that it took for Black women throughout this country to have the right to vote.
Right, and so the question I'm asking, though, is how these new laws might disproportionately affect women. I really get the history.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of how these new laws might disproportionately affect women of color or not.
Well, because it's going to, suppression, voter suppression has the effect of not only presenting physical barriers, but also presenting psychological barriers. People will say to themselves, Black women will say to themselves, so with 9 days with early voting, you have 10 times the opportunity to come out and vote than you would have with only 1 day. Okay. Now, I, as town clerk, I happened to be here all 10 days, and I had the opportunity to oversee voting every day here at Greenburgh Town Hall. There were over 1,000 people here every day. Over 10,000 people came out to vote just here at Town Hall. And every one of those days, we had a racially mixed group of people coming in here to vote. And that is because, one of the reasons I believe is because with the number of days, more people had the opportunity to find and make arrangements to come out and vote. By limiting those numbers of days, you're going to limit the opportunities for people to come out and vote. women of any race, but particularly African-American women, with other voter suppression tactics, it's going to have the effect of discouraging people from voting. And the people who are trying to put these measures into place, they know that. All they have to do is look at history and learn. They see from history what voter suppression can do. And responding to your question, Jason, absolutely. Yes, I feel that it will have a disproportionate impact, not only on African-American women, but on African-Americans in general, and on Latinos, and on people all of color.
People of color. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Jason. Adelaide, you're next.
Speaking of women of color, I just have a happy announcement. I live in Tuckahoe, which is a small village in Westchester County. And for the first time ever, we have just elected a woman as mayor. But she's been a trustee. She's a woman of color. And I'm just so proud that this change has come about in this community. And I'm very happy. It's my anniversary too, so that makes a difference.
Oh, wow. Who just became elected mayor in Tuckahoe?
Omira and
Omira?
Yes, you probably know her.
I know, yes. Oh, wow, amazing.
And Daryl Taylor, who's a recently retired police person and an African-American male, has also been voted in as a trustee. It's been a number of years since we've had an African-American male trustee. So it's been a really good morning.
Yes. Oh, that's just amazing.
Thank you, Adelaide. Is there a question that you wanted to ask or anything else? Okay. John Schwam, you're up. You're on mute, John. You're on mute. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to ask, voter suppression laws have always been a goal of some people, and they've cropped up many times in, the last 100 years. But with the lapsing of the Voter Rights Act of 1965, excuse me, I guess about 4 or 5 years ago now, we've seen a lot more of them. And I think that, let's call them what they are, the people, the racist people that want to enact these laws, racist elected officials that want to enact these laws. More often, what do we think about reauthorizing the 1965 Voting Rights Act? I know Biden has talked about it a little bit on the edges. How important, is that toward making it a lot harder that, as it probably was in the past, for all of these ridiculous suppression laws to be popping up? How important is it to reenact that law?
Thank you, John.
I think it's paramount. It's of most importance. I think that, and I'm so glad you asked that question, because as you were asking that question, I was thinking, what might take everybody is for us to come together in the same way that we saw people of all racial, ethnic backgrounds coming together to march for Black Lives Matters. It may take that for us to come together and rally together for voting under a banner, Voting Rights Matter. Because once we present this unified image of people, regardless as to what our physical characteristics are, once we present a unified front, it cannot be ignored. And it may take that. The professor that I quoted from an article, Pearl Doe, professor at Emory University, she said, efforts to legalize the right to vote have been fraught throughout history with racism and division stemming back. She said this today, in today's times, stemming back to the abolitionist movement. So it's obvious that this struggle is not over. However, I think that with a more unified front, we stand a much greater chance.
Thank you. I don't have anybody else asking questions yet, which is okay, but if you want to, please just raise your hand using the icon. Here's the thing, that I recognized during Miss Beville's presentation, and a lot of good history. My father used to say, if you want to learn something, if you want to really, grow, know your history, know your history to dissolve the mystery. But here we are now, in 2021, and what I'm looking at, what I'm seeing here is how nationally, even though there's stuff that still needs to be healed. That's just what it is. And there's a growing wave of people coming together. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like doing Race Talk every week, because every week the numbers grow, which tells me that every week, not only are we touching lives here, but you guys are going out and talking about whatever you're talking about to help the nation, and even if it's your own community, to grow, because we are truly all in this together. Truly.
Yeah.
Adine. Now, Adine, you found the thumbs up, but you don't know where the raised hand is?
I don't have a raised hand. I only have a clapping and a thumb.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
I have to go back.
Old school, yes.
Old school. Three short points. White supremacy, as it played out during the period of slavery, was disastrous for Black male-female relationships, tore them apart. The second thing is, Black women have never been put on a pedestal like white women. So historically, we have been less hesitant to speak our minds. Being placed on a pedestal has done white women harm. 3, we must be able to handle racism and patriarchy wherever we find it. I'm all for working in solidarity with my Black brothers and husbands. I was married for 50 years and the mother of 2 sons. But when I see patriarchy in the Black community, I challenge it. That's all.
Thank you, Adine. We have Virginia. You're on mute. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, hi. So wonderful to be here today. I missed that week we took off, but I hope you did something fun. Anyway, I just want to say that I am related to Elizabeth Cady Stanton going back about 5 generations. And once it was determined, made public like 2 or 3 years ago, that she was sort of a racist, I wanted to bury my head. Anyway, so I decided it was time to make up for my ancestors' misdeeds. Anyway, so I was involved all last year with a You the Vote, get out the vote, but basically to work on re-registering a lot of people of color in several southern states through Reclaim Our Vote, which is run by Andrea Williams. And I was just so bowled over by the enthusiasm and the organizational skills and whatnot. And so you had, a lot of white women, we're all these white liberal women all over the country.
Okay, she froze up. Looks like you froze up there.
Eugene, let's
Virginia.
see if someone else has a question and we can come back to Virginia.
Right. We have time for one or two more at the max.
No more questions? Any comments?
You know, I see
John?
John. I see John. Okay, go ahead, John.
Oh, here we go.
John, you muted again, honey.
All right, sorry about that. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about a book that was just recently in the New York Times Book Review. That the first lines, noted its controversy, especially at this time. But I think it's some, I've always felt it's really important to understand the past, the motivations, the failings, the wrongs of the past before we can write them in the future. So, John C. Calhoun, a brand new book. I don't think there's ever been an exhaustive, historical study of him. Obviously a loathsome character, but I hope others agree with me that the more we learn about the failings and the wrongs of the past, the better we can understand how to avoid them and write them in the future. So I'm looking forward to reading that book. I just got it. So
thank you for sharing that, John.
And
Yes.
speaking very quickly, speaking of books that to that exact goal that John just said about learning about the past, the truths of the past. The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist. That is a must. See, because the people who are part of this dialogue, I feel, are the people who 150 years ago would be the ones who are advocating for abolition, who are advocating for an end to man's inhumanity towards men. That's who we are here. That book, The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist, like Baptist Church. It is about 400 pages long, but it talks about how American slavery was used to build American capitalism. And it's just chock full of historical facts that say this, we were not taught in school.
Thank you. Thank you.
I love on that subject. Thanks for it. There's a number of good ones.
John, I'm sorry. I have to move on because of time. We have Anne, then we're going to close out the Q&A with Tyrone. Anne?
Hi, thank you. And Judith Beville, I'm so grateful to you. Thank you. Very powerful. I have a comment, and that is, I just see the power of Black women and how they stood up in this last election and how successful they were has terrified white America, particularly the men. And that's why they're fighting back and making all these laws, because they are terrified. And I think we just have to keep up the fight and not let them succeed in their fighting back.
Yeah. Thank you, Ann. Keep on keeping on. Yeah. Brother Ty. So you're not muted, but we can't hear you. Okay. All righty. Oh man.
Is that better? Could you hear me? Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So, Ms. Beville, may I call you Judith?
Of course.
Okay, I'd like that permission. I have not met a Black woman ever in my life who didn't speak her mind. So I just want to add that. That's one, including my wonderful wife. But I do want to say this: the most disturbing thing for me as a Black man is to often see how we treat our Black women. And a part of it is, goes way back. We know that, just for us to define who we are as a man, we often, unfortunately, take it out on Black women. I treat them in a way that's not respectful. And so I just like to remind all our brothers, black or white, how important it is to be respectful, because we came from a womb, you know, and it's just important to realize that and step aside some of the crazy stuff of how we treat each other. That's just not right. So I just wanted to add that with all due respect.
Thank you so very much, Tyrone.
Thank you. Women represent Mother Earth. Have we ever stopped and thought about why the earth is referred to as Mother Earth? Because of what we represent. Now, yes, of course, the earth needs our partners in life, our men as our partners, but think about what the earth brings forth.
Everything.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, as women, that's who we are.
Yeah. Boy, I can talk more about that, but we don't have time. Lane.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Judith, Beville. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. And please don't be a stranger. Please come back. Folks, please join us next week for another episode of Race Talk. We're going to continue to celebrate Women's History Month with our guests, Sandy Burnaby and Candida Brooks. They're going to speak on the topic of why we need anti-racist education. And the two of them are social workers. They're committed to promoting cultural and racial competency. They have designed and led multiple programs aimed at dismantling systemic racism, including the national recognized Undoing Racism workshop. So this is going to be a fabulous discussion. You don't want to miss it. Please bring your friends to join the conversation. Eugene, what's the word?
The word is your voice matters. I think that's the word.
Your voice matters.
Yeah.
That's the word.
Yeah, that is the word. And also, well, so you notice, I don't know if you saw this, and it's about, I got 1 minute to say this, that when I came on, we said, welcome to Race Talk Revolution. And it's because we are wanting to make this a movement, which it already is. And again, your voice matters in us doing what we're doing here. So thank you so much for continuing to show up and being your brilliant selves. Lane?
We love you, everybody. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.
Thank you all for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Judith. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lane.